Sarah Bennett pulled into the parking lot of Jefferson County Courthouse promptly at 9:15 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning. She was not dressed like someone who owned half the commercial properties in downtown Jefferson. Instead, simple blue jeans, a plain white shirt, and comfortable walking shoes were her usual attire for property inspections. The morning had started like any other she had gotten up at 5 a.m. She lived modestly in her meager 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town despite her millionaire value. Her mother had taught her that real wealth was not in the show and tell, but in what one contributed to society. She couldn't help but smile at the irony it all was as she walked up the steps to the courthouse. Just a week ago, her firm had acquired this building in a private holding corporation. It was her latest acquisition in a plan to improve the city's infrastructure while keeping rent affordable for government offices. The parking ticket in her hand was for a mere $50, which received 2 weeks ago when one of the downtown meters had malfunctioned. Sarah had tried calling the clerk's office to explain, but they had insisted she appear in court. She had photos of the broken meter on her phone and all the necessary documentation. It should be a simple matter to resolve. Several people rushed past her on the courthouse steps, most of them wearing suits and carrying briefcases. A few nodded politely, not recognizing her as the owner of numerous buildings they worked in. Sarah preferred it this way. At 35, she had built her real estate empire quietly, letting her work speak for itself rather than broadcasting her success. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning hit her face with a blast of cold air. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the echo of footsteps bounced off the high ceilings. Sarah double-checked the notice. 3B, Courtroom 3B, and Judge William Harrison presiding. While she sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom waiting, Sarah took a look around her. A young mother wrestled with a fussy baby, an elderly man nervously shuffled papers, and 2 teenagers whispered quietly to each other in the corner. She pulled out her phone and reread, one final time, the photographs of the broken meter. At exactly 10 a.m., the BFF opened the courtroom doors. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Harrison. His voice thundered in the room. Sarah rose with the other people in the courtroom as a tall, gray-haired man dressed in black robes strode to the bench. Judge Harrison's reputation preceded him. He was known to be strict, traditional, and some whispered not at all disinterested. As to some defendants, Sarah stood silently. While several cases came before her, she watched as Judge Harrison dispatched each with patience, both solicitous and scant, disproportionately kind to a young, white college student speeding, visibly irritated with a Hispanic man struggling in bad English to explain his case of a traffic violation case, number 247. Sarah Bennett, parking 6 violation. The clerk finally called out. Sarah walked confidently to the podium. Holding as she did, she noticed Judge Harrison was knitting his brows. He lifted his eyes off his papers and saw her for the first time. His eyes narrowed, and so did his lips, which were now a thin line. Miss Bennett, he began, enunciating her name with sarcasm. You are here for a parking violation on Oak Street dated October 15th. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied courtesy. I have proof that the meter was on the fritz that day. A number of other people did also. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison cut her off. The citation clearly states that your meter expired at 2:15 p.m. Are you suggesting our city's equipment is faulty? Sarah tried again. Your Honor, if you'll just look at these photos, I have heard enough excuses today. Judge Harrison cut her off again. His voice carried a tone that many in the courtroom recognized. He had already made up his mind. What Judge Harrison didn't know, as he sat high on his bench looking down at Sarah Bennett in her simple clothes, was that this particular case would soon become the talk of Jefferson County. He had no idea that the quiet woman standing before him owned not just this building, but the ground it was standing on and many others in this city. Then Sarah stood unperturbed, awaiting what was next to happen. Years of dealing in business had taught her patience. Sometimes, She knew you have to let things work their way out before any real change could take effect. The next few minutes would trigger a series of events that would change, if not end, Judge Harrison's career and shake the entire Jefferson County justice system. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, looking down at Sarah with cold eyes. The courtroom was still, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning, the occasional shuffling of papers. Every person present could feel it, tension rising in the air. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said with heavy sarcasm, "perhaps you do not know how things are done in my courtroom. We all waste time making excuses about broken meters." He picked up her file and made a great show of flipping through it slowly. Sarah was calm, though her heart was racing faster. She had dealt with people like Judge Harrison before, people who saw what they wanted to see and made jumping to conclusions based on appearances. She tried one last time to explain. "Your Honor, I have photographs that distinctly demonstrate." Silence. Judge Harrison's voice boomed around the courtroom. Several members of the audience actually jumped in their chairs. "I will not have interruptions in my courtroom." Sarah wasn't the only one who had noticed the difference in tone from 15 minutes earlier, when he had allowed a young white man to explain his case for almost 10 minutes. The contrast was striking, and she wasn't the only one who had noticed it. The court reporter had stopped typing and was watching the scene with concerned eyes now. Then Judge Harrison continued, "This is your third parking violation this year." He looked at her with disapproval, not knowing that the other tickets had already been dismissed when Sarah proved the same meter was broken. "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah spoke carefully, "those previous citations were dismissed because did I give you permission to speak?" Judge Harrison's face was turning slightly red. He turned to his clerk. "Show me M. Bennett's record." The young clerk, Amy, hesitated for a moment. She had seen the dismissal records, but seemed to be afraid to contradict. "Judge, sir, the prior citations were." "Never mind that." Judge Harrison waved his hand. "Miss Bennett, your repeated ignoring of our city's parking laws CHS establishes a course of disregard for authority." A number of the people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A few exchanged concerned glances, and even the bailiff seemed ill at ease, a man who had worked with Judge Harrison for many years. Sarah stood tall and dignified. She was used to being underestimated in business meetings. But this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone that had ever faced unfair treatment in this courtroom. In addition, Judge Harrison continued fidgeting with papers on his desk. "Your casual attitude today shows a lack of respect for this court." He eyed her jeans and comfortable work shirt disapprovingly. He didn't know she had already inspected 3 building sites. The irony of his words wasn't lost on her, as she had signed the papers finalizing her purchase of the courthouse building just last week. It was probably still sitting on some desk in the county clerk's office. "Given your history and attitude," Judge Harrison announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction at having an audience, "I am going to have to fine you $5,000. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Even the other officials looked shocked. The usual fine for a parking violation was $50. "This is clearly excessive, Your Honor." Sarah started, her voice firm despite the anger rising inside. "I would like to appeal this decision." Judge Harrison's smile was cold. "You have that right, of course, but be aware that filing an appeal will add court costs to your fine. Now, do you have anything else to say before we conclude this matter?" Sarah looked around the courtroom. She saw the worried faces of other people waiting for their cases to be heard. She saw the court reporter, who had stopped typing and was staring at her computer screen in disbelief. She saw Amy, the clerk, biting her lip nervously. "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied quietly. "I believe everything that needs to be said will come out soon enough." Judge Harrison, she had passed over the subtle meaning in her words. He was already reaching for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case. "Very well. Pay the fine within 30 days, or face additional penalties. Next case." As Sarah turned to leave, she caught Amy, the clerk's eye. The young woman mouthed, "I'm sorry," when Judge Harrison wasn't looking. Sarah gave her a little, knowing smile. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom, she pulled out her phone. She had a meeting with the county commissioner in exactly 1 hour, a meeting about renovation plans for this very courthouse. Sometime but the truth as to who really owned the courthouse was about to come out, and Judge Harrison's world was about to change forever. At 11:30 a.m., Sarah walked down the courthouse hallway, the unfair $5,000 fine notice clutched in her hand. She checked her watch, and her meeting with County Commissioner James Thompson was at noon. A small smile played on her lips as she headed toward the courthouse cafeteria to grab a quick coffee. The cafeteria was busy with the usual mix of courthouse employees, lawyers, and visitors. Sarah stood in line overhearing snippets of conversation about what had just happened in courtroom 3B. Word was spreading fast about Judge Harrison's excessive fine. "Did you hear about that parking ticket case?" one young lawyer whispered to another. $5,000 for a parking violation? That's insane. Classic Harrison, his colleague replied, shaking his head. "He has been getting worse lately. Really, someone needs to report him to the Judicial Review Board." Sarah paid for her coffee, finding a quiet corner table, pulled out her phone, and called her assistant. "Michael, could you bring the courthouse renovation plans to my meeting with Commissioner Thompson?" And yes, everything is going precisely as we expected. Meanwhile, back in his chambers, Judge Harrison was feeling quite smug. He sat in his leather chair, eating the sandwich his secretary had brought him for lunch. A knock on his door interrupted his meal. "Come in," he called out, mouthful of turkey sandwich. "Emmy." The court clerk entered nervously. "Judge Harrison, I think there's something you should know about the Bennett case from this morning." "What about it?" he asked, barely looking up from his desk. "Sir, I checked her rec more thoroughly. Those previous tickets were all dismissed with evidence. The meter on Oak Street has been malfunctioning for months. The city's maintenance records confirm it." Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "It's of no consequence now. The fine's been determined. She won't be disrespecting my courtroom again anytime soon." Amy paused, then spoke again. "Sir, there's one other thing. I saw her name on some papers that came through the county clerks last week." Before she could proceed any further, Judge Harrison's phone called. It was the county commissioner's office. They needed to see him at a meeting at 12:30 p.m. Something about courthouse renovations, the secretary had said back in the cafeteria. Sarah finished her coffee just as Michael appeared with a thick folder of blueprints and documents. "Perfect timing," she said, rising. "Let's head to the commissioner's office." Commissioner Thompson's office was on the top floor of the courthouse, with large windows that looked out over the city. When Sarah and Michael entered, Thompson greeted them warmly. "Miss Bennett, nice of you to come. I have been anxious to hear your plans for renovating the building." He motioned for them to take a seat in the plush chairs across from his desk. Sarah spread the blueprints out onto the commissioner's enormous desk. "As you can see, we will renovate the building, but keep its historic characteristics. The first phase of the renovation will include new acoustics in all of the courtrooms and new technology." They were well into discussion when there was another knock at the door. Judge Harrison entered, then stopped dead where he was when he saw Sarah sitting there. His face went white. "Ah, Judge Harrison," Commissioner Thompson said cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I wanted you to meet Ms. Bennett properly. She is the new owner of the courthouse building. She had some nice improvements to speak to you about that she's planning to make to your courtroom." Judge Harrison stood frozen in the doorway, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water. Sarah turned to face him. Her expression was professional and composed. "Judge Harrison and I have already met," she said calmly. "In fact, he has just imposed on me a $5,000 fine for an infringement of meter parking where maintenance records demonstrate that it has been broken for months." Commissioner Thompson's eyebrows shot up. $5,000 for a parking ticket? Yes, Sarah continued, her voice steady. "It was quite an interesting experience seeing how justice is administered in the courthouse. I now own the color drained from Judge Harrison's face as the reality of the situation sank in. The woman he had treated so dismissively less than 2 hours ago wasn't just any citizen, she was his new landlord. I believe, Sarah added, turning back to the blueprints, that Courtroom 3B will be the first to receive renovations. We'll need to temporarily relocate those proceedings during construction. Of course, Judge Harrison remained standing in the doorway. His earlier confidence completely evaporated the day that it started so normally had just taken an unexpected turn, and he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of his problems. The news spread through the Jefferson County Courthouse like wildfire by 2 p.m. Everyone from the janitors to the senior judges knew what had happened in Commissioner Thompson's office. The story grew with every retelling about how Judge Harrison had found the very woman who owned the building they were all working in. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, his hands shaking as he poured his third cup of coffee this morning. The events of this morning replayed over and over again in his mind. He was so quick to judge Sarah Bennett, so sure of his authority, and now it had all come to pieces. A knock on his door made him jump. It was Chief Judge Martinez, his supervisor. "Bill, we need to talk." Chief Judge Martinez said, closing the door behind him. His face was serious. "I've received 3 calls in the last hour about what happened this morning. The local news is asking for comments." Judge Harrison slumped in his chair. "I didn't know who she was," he said weakly. "That's exactly the problem," Martinez replied sharply. "You shouldn't treat anyone that way regardless of who they are." $5,000 for a parking ticket. What were you thinking? Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her downtown office reviewing emails were coming in. Local civil rights groups wanted to meet with her. Others who, likewise, had been treated like dirt in Judge Harrison's courtroom were calling to tell their stories. Her assistant, Michael, knocked and entered with a stack of papers. "Miss Bennett, the courthouse maintenance records you requested are here." They confirmed to them that the meter on Oak Street has been reported as broken 8 times over the past 3 months. Sarah nodded as she flipped through the documents. "And here is the video footage, right here," Michael said, placing a USB drive on her desk. "The security cameras caught everything in the courtroom." The court reporter also sent over the official transcript. Back at the courthouse, Amy, the clerk, was busy pulling files from Judge Harrison's previous cases. She had been keeping notes for months, worried about the pattern she saw in his rulings. Now finally, someone might actually listen. The door to Judge Harrison's chambers burst open, and his secretary knocked again. "Sir, there's a reporter from the Jefferson Daily News Online. 1. They're running a story about this morning's incident. Tell them no comment." He snapped, instantly regretting the sharpness of his tone. He was beginning to think he spoke to everyone that way. 3:30 p.m. Another meeting, this one with her lawyers. They sat in her conference room, reviewing the morning's events. "The fine was obviously excessive," her lead attorney said. "But more importantly, we have found a pattern of similar behavior in Judge Harrison's courtroom. In fact, the data indicate large disparities in how he treats different defendants based upon their race and appearance." Sarah stared out her office window at the Courthouse building across the street. "This isn't a story about revenge," she said contemplatively. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Back in his chambers, Judge Harrison received another visitor. His old friend and fellow judge, Robert Chin. "Bill," Judge Chin said, lowering himself heavily, "I've been your friend for 20 years. I need to be honest with you. What happened today, it's not an isolated incident. We've all seen the way you handle certain defendants differently." Judge Harrison began to object, but Judge Chin helped hold him up. "Listen to me. Well, this was your wake-up call, or it could mark the end of your career." Late afternoon, Sarah received a call from Commissioner Thompson. "Miss Bennett, the Judicial Review Board has called for an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They have requested your presence." "I'll be there," Sarah replied. "And Commissioner, would you mind letting Judge Harrison know my plans for renovating his courtroom haven't changed? Sometimes, The best way to fix a broken system is from within the sunset that lay over Jefferson County. Sarah sat in her office, reflecting on another day past, one more step in her quiet mission of betterment for the community. For Judge Harrison, it was the painful but necessary lesson about justice and prejudice that came from judging a book by its cover. Of course, the real changes were only just beginning, and for all parties involved, the following morning would bring with it even more surprises. The next morning, the Jefferson County Judicial Review Board convened in their upstairs in the courthouse conference room. 7 members sat around a great, large, old oak table with David Roberts as chairman of the meeting. The room was tight while they awaited the arrival of Sarah Bennett, precisely at 9 a.m. In walked Sarah, professionally dressed in her navy blue suit. This time, there was no mistaking her position of authority. Her attorney, Jennifer Martinez, was already awake bigger, holding a thick file full of papers. "Thank you for being here, Miss Bennett," Chairman Roberts said, nodding toward an empty chair. "We've convened this emergency meeting to discuss the incident yesterday, and then some broader concerns that have come to light." Just then Amy, the court clerk, came in with a cart full of files. "These are all the cases from Judge Harrison's courtroom from over the past year," she explained. Her voice shook very slightly. "I've been keeping track of the patterns." The board looked on in concern at the mountain of files. SS lawyer stood up and began passing around reports that she had prepared. "What you're receiving," Jennifer explained, "is a statistical analysis of Judge Harrison's rulings over the past 12 months. The data shows clear patterns of bias in his sentencing." Chairman Roberts put on his reading glasses and studied the first page. His frown deepened. "According to these numbers, Judge Harrison gives fines averaging 200% higher to minorities compared to white defendants for the same violations." Down in his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone and waited. He had not slept much that night, as his mind kept racing with contemplation over his actions. His phone rang non-stop in the voice of one reporter after another. He ignored them all. Sarah's voice remained calm as she began. "Yesterday's incident, my parking ticket isn't just about me. It is about every person that has walked into that courtroom and been dealt with unfairly." The board members listened as Sarah played the security footage of the previous day, watched Judge Harrison's dismissive behavior, his interruptions, and his excessive fine. Then they watched footage from other cases showing in stark contrast how differently he had treated the various defendants. "This is disturbing," said board member Janet Chun, shaking her head. "But what is worse is that no one caught it. Nobody stopped it." Emmy spoke again. "Many of us knew. We were too afraid to speak up. Judge Harrison has a lot of clout around here." Halfway through, Commissioner Thompson burst in with more evidence. "We've looked into the maintenance records for that parking meter," he announced. "It was reported in several times. And Judge Harrison knew. But he just disregarded it." Sarah got up and went to the window, staring out at the city below. "I am not here to request Judge Harrison's removal," she said, surprising everyone. "I'm here to propose a solution." She turned back to face the board. "As the owner of this building, I have plans for renovations. But maybe we need to renovate more than just the physical structure. Maybe we need to change how justice is administered here." The board members exchanged glances. Chairman Roberts leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Bennett?" "A complete overhaul of the system," Sarah replied. "Mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular review of sentencing patterns, and a new community oversight committee. I'll fund them myself." The room was silent as all digested her words. Finally, board member Michael Wong spoke up. "We should also go back and review all Judge Harrison's cases from the past year. Some may be entitled to refunds or appeals." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And I want to be part of that process." As the afternoon wore on, word leaked out into the courthouse about what was taking place. Employees huddled in small clusters discussing changes that may be forthcoming. A few were nervous, but many felt hopeful that by noon several decisions were taken. Judge Harrison would be temporarily suspended pending a full investigation. All of his recent cases were to be reviewed, and most important of all, Sarah's proposed reforms were to be brought in. As Sarah stepped out of the meeting, she walked past Judge Harrison's empty courtroom. Through its window, she could see his vacant judge's chair. Sometimes, she thought the biggest changes started with the smallest incidents, such as with a simple parking ticket. The real work was only just beginning in Jefferson County. The courthouse house would never be the same again. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his home study, staring at the suspension letter from the Judicial Review Board. The morning newspaper was on his desk, screaming its headline, "Local Judge Under Investigation. Years of Bias Rulings Exposed." His phone had been ringing for days, but not one call had he answered. His wife, Linda, tapped softly upon the door to the study and entered with a cup of coffee. "Bill," she said softly, "you need to eat something. You have been sitting here since yesterday." He looked up at his wife of 30 years, seeing the concern in her eyes. "How did I not see it, Linda?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I thought I was being fair." Linda sat down across from him. "Remember what your father used to say about Judge Matthews back in the 60s? How he treated your Irish immigrant grandparents in his courtroom?" The memory hit Judge Harrison hard. His grandfather had lost his small business because of Judge Matthews' unfair ruling. He had promised himself he would never be that kind of judge. Yet here he was, decades later, pulling the same on others. Back in the courthouse, the night clerk, Amy, was guiding the review team through old cases presided over by Judge Harrison. Each folder was a story of subliminal bias. Higher fines for minorities, stricter sentences, less patience during hearings. "Look at this one," Amy says to Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer. "A young black man got 6 months for the same offense that a white college student got community service for just last month." Sarah Bennett walks into the room, carrying takeout dinner. "For the team, how many cases have we reviewed so far?" "Over 200, Jennifer replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "The pattern is clear. In almost everyone." Back at his house, Judge Harrison finally decided to watch the security footage from his courtroom that the board had provided for 6 hours straight. He watched himself in case after case. He saw his expressions, heard his tone, noticed his different treatment of defendants based on their appearance and race. In one video, he watched himself interrupt a Hispanic mother trying to explain her situation, whereas in the case following, he had patiently heard a white businessman for nearly 20 minutes. The juxtaposition was painful to see. Later that evening, Judge Harrison's daughter Rachel, also a law student herself, visited her father. She found her father still in his study, surrounded by case files that he had brought home. "Dad," she said, sitting beside him, "my professor used one of your cases as an example in class today, not in a good way." He looked into his daughter, seeing disappointment in her eyes. "I bet you down, haven't I? You can still make it." "Corrected," Rachel responded, "but first you really have to understand what you did wrong." Meanwhile, on campus, Sarah sat at her desk working over the proposed adjustments to the courthouse. The blueprints for physical renovations now included a new community justice center where judges would receive routine training on bias and equitable treatment. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Linda Harrison, the judge's wife. "Miss Bennett, my husband would like to meet with you, not to make excuses but to listen and learn. Would you be willing to give him that chance?" Sarah stared at the message for a long time. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. This was about real change being created. Sometimes that meant giving people a chance to learn from their mistakes. She typed her reply the following morning, 9 a.m. Ask him to bring any notes he doubtless has been taking about his cases under review. That evening, Sarah and Judge Harrison lay in their beds, awake over the meeting that would take place the following morning. For Sarah, this was one more step toward a dream of reforming the justice system. It was a time for Judge Harrison to atone for years of unconscious prejudice. The next day would be the beginning of something real, or it would be the final nail in the coffin of Judge Harrison's career. It depended on what he learned from this reflective time, and whether he was truly prepared to change. It was about to get its next PH at precisely 9:00 a.m. The transformation of Jefferson County's justice system. Judge William Harrison stood outside the Sarah Bennett's office. His hands were shaking as he held a thick notebook filled with his observations from reviewing his past cases. He hadn't slept much during the night, having spent most of it writing down every instance of bias he could find in his rulings. The guard at the front desk gave him a knowing glance. "Miss Bennett is expecting you, Judge Harrison. 15th floor." The elevator ride seemed to take longer than it actually was. When the doors finally opened, Sarah's assistant Michael was waiting for him. "Please follow me, Judge Harrison. Miss Bennett is ready to see you." Sarah's office was Spartan, yet elegant in a markedly understated way, with large windows that overlooked the courthouse, where Judge Harrison had presided for 20 years. She stood as he entered and gestured to a chair across the desk from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said, his voice humble beyond anything anyone had ever heard. "I know I don't deserve your time." Sarah studied him carefully. Arrogant judge from a few days ago was gone. In his place sat a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, the weight of his realizations heavy on his shoulders. "Judge Harrison," Sarah began, "I didn't agree to this meeting to hear apologies. I want to hear what you've learned from reviewing your cases." He opened his notebook with shaking hands. "I spent the last 3 days watching videos from my courtroom and reading through my old cases. The patterns are clear now. I was harder on minorities, quicker to interrupt them, less likely to believe their explanations." Sarah listened in silence as Judge Harrison went through specific cases he had written down, names, dates, and details of where his bias had affected his decisions. "There was Maria Rodriguez," he said, his voice cracking. "She tried to explain that she was late to court because her child was in the hospital. I fined her $500 for contempt. The very next day, I accepted a similar excuse from a white defendant without question." Tears welled up in his eyes as he continued, "And James Washington, a young black man who got 6 months for a minor offense that I usually gave community service for. These are just 2 examples out of hundreds." Sarah took out her own folder. "We've been reviewing those cases too, Judge Harrison. What do you think should be done about them? They all deserve new hearings," he replied without hesitation, "and I've written personal letters to each person I treated unfairly, admitting my bias and apologizing. They're all in this folder." He placed another thick envelope on her desk. Sarah raised her eyebrows, genuinely surprised. She hadn't expected him to take such an initiative. "But that's not enough," Judge Harrison continued. "I want to do more. I've enrolled in bias training courses and am working with civil rights organizations to better understand the impact of systemic racism in our justice system." For the first time since the meeting began, Sarah smiled slightly. "That's a good start, Judge Harrison. But what about the future? What happens when you return to the bench?" Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. "If I'm allowed to return, I want to implement a system where all my rulings are reviewed monthly for bias. I want to work with community leaders to understand their perspective." And he paused, taking a deep breath. "I want to mentor young judges to help them avoid making the same mistakes I did." Sarah stood and walked to the window, staring at the courthouse. "Judge Harrison, when I bought that building, I didn't just buy property. I bought an opportunity to create change. Your situation has given us the opportunity to change the whole system." She turned back to face him. "I'm willing to support your return to the bench. Under certain conditions. You will work with our new Community Oversight Committee. You'll go through regular bias training, and most importantly, you'll help us implement these changes throughout the courthouse." Judge Harrison bobbed his head animatedly. "Whatever it takes to make it right, I do." "Good," Sarah said, "as this isn't just about you anymore, but building a system of justice that truly will serve them all equally." As Judge Harrison left Sarah's office that morning, he was humble and hopeful because he was being given a chance not only to redeem his career, but also to be part of the change he had longed for in a system to which he had devoted his life. The change was well on its way, deep within Judge Harrison and in the Jefferson County justice system. 3 months had passed since that meeting between Sarah Bennett and Judge Harrison. Indeed, the Jefferson County Courthouse was different now. Laborers were busy renovating the building, but more important changes were happening in its people. This morning, Judge Harrison stood before a packed courtroom. But he wasn't sitting on the bench. Instead, he was teaching a group of judges, lawyers, and court staff about recognizing unconscious bias. "I would have sworn I didn't have any prejudice," he said to the attentive audience. "Let me show you exactly how bias can creep into our decisions without us even knowing it." In the back of the room, Sarah watched with satisfaction. The man speaking was nothing like the arrogant judge who had fined her 3 months ago. His hair had more gray now, but his eyes showed wisdom that hadn't been there before. "Emmy," the court clerk raised her hand. "Judge Harrison, what's the biggest change you've noticed in yourself since the training began?" Harrison smiled thoughtfully. "I listened more. Really listened. Yesterday a young man came in for a traffic violation. In the past, I would have rushed through his explanation. Instead, I learned he was driving his sick mother to chemotherapy. That context mattered." Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, the new Community Oversight Committee was meeting. The committee created by Sarah included people from all parts of the community: teachers, social workers, ex-defendants, and civil rights activists. The numbers are encouraging. Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer, reported to the committee, "In the last 3 months, we have reviewed over 500 old cases, given more than 200 people refunds for excessive fines, and reopened 50 cases for new hearings." In the training session, Judge Harrison showed video clips from his old sessions in court and compared them with recent clips. The difference was striking. "Watch how I interrupted this woman 6 times in 2 minutes," he said, pointing to an old video. "Now watch a similar case from last week. Defendant speaks freely and justice is better served because of it." During the lunch break, Sarah met with Commissioner Thompson in the new courthouse cafe, another of her improvements to the building. "The changes you and Judge Harrison have made are catching," Thompson said animatedly. 3 other courthouses in the state have inquired about instituting similar training programs. Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee. "That's good news, but we're just getting started. Next week we're launching the Youth Justice Program." The Youth Justice Program had been Sarah's latest undertaking. It would bring high school students into the courthouse to learn about the legal system and participate in mock trials. Judge Harrison had volunteered to lead the program. Later that afternoon, a face he knew appeared in Judge Harrison's new courtroom. Maria Rodriguez was a woman to whom he had given an unfair fine several months ago. This time, she was there to join the Community Oversight Committee. "Welcome, Mrs. Rodriguez," Harrison said cordially, coming down from the bench to greet her. "Your insight will be so valuable to our committee." Maria seemed taken aback by his friendly demeanor. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. My English, it is still not perfect. But your English is fine," he assured her, "and we now have court translators available whenever needed. That's one of the many changes Ms. Bennett helped us institute." At the end of the day, Sarah walked through the courthouse, observing all the changes. The walls had fresh paint, but more importantly, the halls were filled with new faces. People from all parts of the community even now felt welcome in their courthouse. She passed by Judge Harrison's courtroom one last time. He was still there, reviewing cases with a young law student intern. "Remember," she heard him say, "justice isn't just about following the law. It's about seeing the human being in front of you." Sarah smiled to herself. The parking ticket that had started all this was framed in her office, now a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. As she exited the building, she saw a group of community members entering for the evening's public forum. Was another new initiative. The courthouse had no longer become a building where justice was served, but had also become a hub for community transformation. The story of the judge and the owner of the courthouse had become a symbol of change, not only in Jefferson County, but in courthouses across the state. Sometimes true justice begins with one man's openness to learning from his mistakes, and another person giving him that chance. 1 year has passed since that day when Sarah Bennett walked into Judge Harrison's courtroom based on a simple parking violation. The Jefferson County Courthouse was celebrating its first anniversary of the Justice Reform Program, and the main hall was filled with every kind of person. Up at the podium stood Sarah, looking into the crowd. Seated in the front row sat Judge Harrison, his family to his side, Maria Rodriguez, Emmy the clerk, and so many others who a year earlier had formed part of this amazing journey. And then Sarah said her piece in a clear, strong voice. I walked into this courthouse as just another person with a parking ticket. Today we stand here celebrating something much bigger than any one person or incident. The walls of the courthouse told their own story. New signs in many languages welcomed visitors. The halls displayed artwork from local artists showing scenes of justice and community. Every tom now had translation services and cultural sensitivity advisors. Next, Judge Harrison, who was now taking over the mantle of heading judicial training, rose to address the gathering. He looked different from a year ago, much more humble, more approachable, and definitely wiser. I made the mistake last year that could have ended my career, he said candidly. Instead, thanks to him, Bennett's vision, it became an opportunity to create real change. We've helped other people learn from my mistakes. The numbers spoke for themselves. Posted on a large board where the year's achievements read, 1,000 cases reviewed and corrected, 300 judges and court staff trained in bias awareness, 50 community programs launched, 5 other correctional houses adopting their reform model, 0 complaints of racial bias in the past 6 months. Maria Rodriguez stepped forward to tell her story. A year ago, I was too afraid to come to this courthouse, she said, her English now much improved. I now help other people feel welcome here. This is what real justice looks like. Amy, now promoted to Chief Court Administrator, introduced the next stage of their programs. We start next month. We are opening our Youth Justice Academy. High school kids will learn about the law and justice from Judge Harrison here, and these other reformed judges in the audience. In the back of the room, local news reporters were taking notes. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become a national model for justice reform. Visitors from other states regularly came to learn from their example. Sarah listened as Judge Harrison's daughter, now a newly graduated LA lawyer, talked about the courthouse legal clinic she was opening. This would offer free representation to indigent people who cannot afford to hire lawyers. My father taught our whole family about the value of fair justice, Rachel said. Now, I want to help make sure that everyone has access to it. Towards the end of the ceremony, a very surprised visitor was the mayor of Jefferson City. He had in his hands an official proclamation that this day was Justice Reform Day in the city. What transpired in this courthouse over the course of a year proves that change is possible, announced the mayor. One parking ticket reversed our justice system. Judge Harrison walked across to Sarah holding something in his hands. It was a framed copy of the original $5,000 fine he had given her. I keep this in my chambers, he said quietly. It reminds me every day to look past my assumptions and to be able to see the real person standing in front of me. Sarah smiled and pulled out her own copy of that same ticket, framed in her office. Sometimes the best lessons come from places that are just a little unexpected. And with that, the celebration ensued. sharing of stories on how the courthouse changed lives. A young man spoke to a second chance through the new rehabilitation program. A grandmother spoke to how the new translation services helped her family make sense of the system. And the day closed with a community dinner, and the people from all walks of life sat together in the courthouse plaza, sharing food and stories. Judge Harrison was sitting with Maria Rodriguez's family, learning Spanish from her children. Sarah watched it all from a quiet corner, heart full and proud of what they had pulled off. The parking ticket that started it all, but now a memory, its ripples would go on for generations. The Jefferson County Courthouse had grown beyond the building to represent justice, and, when truly blind to color and status, the change it could affect within a community. With the entire community, as the sun set on the celebration, Sarah knew this was not the end of the story, but a new beginning to their continued struggle for true justice for all.